Well, in this closing session, I want to draw together some of the threads of the conference. I think there have been certain common themes and threads that have emerged over these 2 days. In one sense, every session has been very different, and yet there are certain emphases which I believe have been laid upon us by the Holy Spirit during these days. Now, I want us to turn to these verses that Gary read to us. We're going to meditate for a little while on verses 9 to 17. This passage is all about the work of building local churches. Paul, of course, was the founder of the church in Corinth. He laid the foundation of that church. Verse 10, "By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder." And the foundation that Paul laid there in Corinth was the foundation of Christ himself. That's what he goes on to say in verse 11. "For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ." Once and for all, Christ is the foundation of the church universal. It was the Father who set Jesus Christ in place as the great foundation stone, the rock on which the whole church is built. And so when Paul came to Corinth, his great concern was that he should lay in that specific place the foundation that was already laid in God's purpose and great scheme. Paul was determined that that church should be built on Christ alone. And so Paul came to Corinth determined to preach nothing but Christ and him crucified. He preached the fullness, the all-sufficiency of Christ, who has become for us wisdom from God, righteousness, holiness, redemption. And Paul called men and women from their sins, and he summoned them into union with Christ. He baptized the first converts in the name of Christ, Gaius, Crispus, the household of Stephanas. And then those folk in turn baptized others in the name of Christ. They understood that they were being gathered into union with Jesus Christ himself. And Paul instituted the Lord's Supper in that church. And he taught those men and women that they came together around the table as the body of Christ. He taught them that they lived by eating Christ and drinking Christ. He taught them at that table to remember Christ and to feed on Christ and to look for Christ to come again. Paul, you see, was determined that that church should be founded on Christ alone, that it should be a company of men and women brought together by this one thing, that they are in Christ, believing him, loving him, obeying him, absorbed in him, worshipping him with all their being. That is the foundation that God has laid for the whole church, the church in all places and at all times. And equally, it is the foundation then of every true local church. If a church is not built on Christ, then it is not a church at all, because it has no foundation. So Paul built as a master builder, an expert builder, verse 10. Paul dug deep to establish that foundation, preaching Christ in season and out of season, preaching the cross. He died for our sins according to the Scriptures. preaching the reality of that death. He was buried, preaching the resurrection. He rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures, and was seen. Those were Paul's great themes when he came to Corinth. He could never speak of them too often. Every member of that church must understand those great themes. Christ's person, Christ's work. Maybe some of those folk in that church would have understood very little else. Maybe some of them would have seen very little of the full-orbed system of Bible doctrine. But they knew Christ. That was Paul's great concern. That was his great priority. That there should be this wholehearted attachment to the Lord Jesus Christ himself. Because that is the foundation on which the church is built. Faith in Christ, love for Christ, day by day obedience to Christ himself. So the foundation was laid there in Corinth by Paul, the apostle of Christ. He established that church firmly on the foundation of Jesus Christ. And then Paul moved on from Corinth. And it was left to other men then to continue the work that Paul had begun, to build on the foundation that Paul had laid. Peter, Cephas, he played his part. And Apollos, he had his work to do in building up that church in Corinth. And then a whole circle of local leaders, men from within the city of Corinth, began to be raised up within that church. And each one added something to the building of this church. Day after day, that church was progressing, growing larger in numbers, developing its patterns of worship, developing new structures, new activities, working out its role in the social life of Corinth, and changing in all those ways that are necessary in order to be a fully developed, mature, complete local church. That church, like any other church, had to grow from those first beginnings. And different men were shaping that process. Different men were building on the foundation that Paul had laid. What a responsibility that is. To shape, to direct the building of the church of God. Look what Paul says in verse 9. We are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. This church is God's church. He's building it. It's his field from which he plans to gather his harvest. It's his building, it's his property. And yet these men have the day-by-day responsibility of directing and shaping the way that that building is going to grow. And not just for one generation, but for generations to come. It would be so easy, wouldn't it, for those men to begin to think of this as their church. After all, that's the way we think of the things that we administer in every other sphere of life. A group of men own a company. Well, it's their company. They run it. They plan its future development. It belongs to them to shape it as they think fit. They have their objectives for the company. They have their dreams. And so they carry them through then in the way that they think best to build up their company. And how easy it would be then for these men in Corinth, these gifted, influential men. Some of them were enormously gifted. How easy it would be to them to think of the work of the church in that way. to imagine that they are building their project. And Paul says, no, never forget, it's God's field. It's God's building. You have been called alongside God to work on his property as his servants, under his direction, according to his will. What huge responsibility there is there. You are handling God's property day by day. You're making decisions day by day that affect God's harvest field, God's building, and you will answer to God for it. So that is the central thrust of these verses. Now let's unpack this a little further under two main headings. Paul is addressing these church builders in Corinth, and he is addressing us. We are men and women involved in the work of building local churches. Now, what would Paul's exhortation to us be if he were standing here this afternoon? What would Paul be saying to us? I think he would be saying two things. Firstly, he would say, remember what you are building. You're building a social institution, aren't you? That's true enough. A church plays a distinctive role in the wider social community. You're building a financial institution. A church will inevitably own some property and have to administer its resources. You're building a mutual assistance society. The members of a church have a unique responsibility to care for one another. You're building a missionary organization. Yes, of course, we've been given the great mandate to take the gospel to the world. Yes, Paul would say all these things are surely true. The local church does play all these roles. But none of these are what the church is. Verse 16, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? That is what the church is. And Paul is talking about the local church. It is God's temple. It is God's dwelling place. The reason the church exists in Corinth or in Philippi or in Childs Hill or in Stockport, the raison d'etre of the church is to be a dwelling place of God by his Spirit, a place worthy to be the home of the eternal triune God, a place that reflects his majesty, his beauty, his splendor, a place that makes the reality of God visible to the world, a place appropriate for him, a place where he'll feel at home. That's what you're building. Wherever you are, you're not building for yourselves. You're building a palace for the King of Kings, for the Lord of Glory, in London or in Stowmarket or in Chester. Paul is saying to these men, have you realized the full dimensions of what you're involved in? You see, when you do realize that, it transforms the way you look at everything, doesn't it? As I say, we're all concerned with building churches, aren't we? We're all interested in seeing progress. And so I suppose we could go around and ask each one of you in turn, what's your primary goal? In all your strategy, in all your planning, what's your goal in the way you build the church? What's the primary criterion you bring to this work of church building? And one man will say, well, I want to build a church where folk will feel secure and cared for. And someone else will say, I want to build a church that will stand firm to be a witness among the corruptions of our society. And another brother will say, I want to see a church where unbelievers will be able to come in and feel welcome and listen to the gospel. And all of those things are good things. But if you turn to Paul, and if you say to Paul, but what sort of church do you want to build? He'll answer, I want to build a church where God is in the midst. A church where God delights to dwell. A church where God's presence is manifest. A church where God is at home among his people. A church where men and women catch glimpses of the reality of God. They see the beauty of God in his sanctuary. And they're moved to awe and adoration and worship and love. I want to build a temple for God. Never forget it. A local church built on the foundation of Jesus Christ is the most awesome, the most extraordinary institution in the universe, because it is the dwelling place of God. The highest heavens cannot contain him. And yet when a local church gathers in the name of Christ, God in all his infinitude is in the midst. We see it prefigured, don't we, in the institutions of Old Testament times. You see the Israelites in the wilderness building the tabernacle. Or you see Solomon in Jerusalem building the temple. And we read through those chapters, and sometimes we're bemused by all the detail of these constructions, and the posts and the sockets and the multicolored curtains and the tassels and the badger skins and the cedar boards and all those exact measurements and all the furnishings. And we shake our heads and we say, but what's it all supposed to mean? How am I supposed to benefit from that? But then as you read and reread those chapters, the power of them begins to touch your heart. And you begin to realize what God is saying to his people. It must be perfect. It must be perfect. If you are building a dwelling place for me, it must be perfect. It must be built according to the pattern I've shown you. And it must be perfect because it's my house. Everything in that temple had to be worthy of the God whose dwelling place it was. The stones were perfectly shaped before ever they were brought to the temple site. The polished cedar boards, the radiant colors, and the purest gold. It's for God, and it must reflect his glory. This temple there on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, it must be a pale reflection of the beauty of Jehovah. Everything in its architecture, everything in its design, everything in the furnishings must shout out the fact that God is great and pure and majestic and holy and mighty, and that he's here among his people. those folk who gathered around Solomon's temple, they knew what that temple was for. It was for God. In that temple, God was going to dwell. In that temple, God was going to reveal himself. In that temple, God was going to call his people near to himself and issue his commands to them and listen to their cries to him. In that temple, God was going to be seen and worshipped and adored. It is the greatest privilege and the greatest responsibility any man, any woman can have here in this world to play a part in building the church of God. In your situation, in your village, in that inner city enclave in Soho that we were hearing about yesterday, or among the Rendile in remote northern Kenya, you are building something infinitely more glorious, infinitely more majestic than Solomon's temple in all its glory. That little gathering of believers in that shabby hall, that gathering is a temple infinitely more wonderful than the temple that Solomon built with all its colour and with all its splendour and all its vast scale. You are playing a part in building that temple. Day by day, with every decision you make, every prayer you pray, every visit you carry through, every meeting, every handshake, every sermon, you are building, you are shaping the temple of the living God. So Paul says, consider what you are building. Realize what a vast and glorious enterprise you are involved in. The angels are not allowed to play a part in this. This is your calling, to build the temple of the living God here on earth. And then Paul adds, secondly, so consider how you are building. Verse 10, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds. That is the thrust of Paul's concern. Consider how you are building. And then Paul goes on to suggest two possible building strategies, two ways a man can build. Verse 12, if any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, that's the first approach to building. Here is a man. He's conscious that he's building something for God, and he's determined that it shall be for God's glory. And he knows that God is a God of perfection and purity, and therefore he is determined that God's church should be as pure and as perfect as God himself. And so he is determined that he will build with the most precious and treasured materials. So he invests in gold. Maybe he goes out and buys it at vast expense and makes huge sacrifices in order to purchase that gold. Or maybe he has to mine it for himself and then refine it. And after years of work, he only has a tiny quantity. But it's pure and it's precious. Likewise, he seeks out the finest silver. And then he begins to search out precious stones. And each one of those stones is chosen individually. And then he has to cut it. And that's a task of huge delicacy. And then it has to be polished through many long, long hours. And these are the materials he brings to the building of the temple. They're hard won, they're rare, but they're infinitely precious. It's with these materials that he builds the house of God. He's not willing to accept any compromises. However slowly the work is going to progress, he's going to build it out of gold and silver and precious stones. He won't accept any inferior materials. It may take his lifetime to put in place one windowsill, but it'll be made of solid gold, and it'll be studded with the finest rubies. It's a slow, painstaking task. And at times he must wonder if it would be wiser to lower his standards and to aim for quicker results. But no, he says to himself again and again, it's God's temple I'm building. It's God's temple I'm building. How can I use anything but the purest gold if this house is for God? How can I leave this jewel half polished if this jewel is going to reflect God's glory? Read again those chapters from the Old Testament about the building of the temple in Jerusalem. How careful the temple builders were, how exact they were in all their toil. They measured each stone to size, and they cut it and they polished it before one of those stones was brought to the temple site, so there wouldn't be the sound of a tool in the temple area. How exact they had to be. But at least those men were working with huge slabs of stone. But this man, the church builder Paul is talking about, is building a temple exclusively in gold and silver and precious stones, jewels. It's costly, it's sacrificial, at times it's agonizing. But this man can do no other, because he has caught a vision of the perfection and purity of God. Now, what does this mean in terms of our work? What does it mean to build with gold and silver and precious stones? It means that we do everything in a way that matches the perfections of God himself. It means that firstly, our work is done to the glory of God alone. Our work is done in such a way that God alone is glorified. It means that we reject every method, every strategy of building that would promote men and women, and that would flatter them and give them opportunity for self-display. Ostentatious, man-centered programs where great men are held up for admiration and applauded. Worship programs where self-seeking entertainers express themselves and display their gifts for our admiration and for their own fulfillment. Elderships and deaconates, where men are put into positions of leadership because they have the right image and they have the right professional background and they wear the right suit. We reject it all, don't we? We reject any strategy of leadership, any strategy of church building that is going to lift up men for admiration. Soli Deo Gloria. It's not just a slogan. It has to be written over the whole life of the whole church. That was Paul's great strategy when he came to Corinth. There were methods he could have used that, humanly speaking, might have brought him instant success. And he refuses them. He refuses them for one reason alone, that they were methods that would rob God of his glory. You know, there's a most fascinating sidelight in Acts upon the ministry of Paul in Corinth. Paul in Corinth never cut his hair. You remember Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, says, long hair is a shame unto a man. Long hair is a disgrace. And so it was in a cultured Greek city. You've seen the statues and the coins of Greek men, how trim they are, how neat their hair is, how civilized they look. Paul, when he went to Corinth, made a Nazirite vow. He never cut his hair in Corinth. You remember, he only cut it when he left the city and came to Cenchrea. Now, why was that? Well, precisely because he knew the temptation within him to pride. And he wanted so much in that city to present himself as the cultured, sophisticated, intelligent man, worthy of the applause of these intellectual Greeks. It would have been so easy for him to rob God of his glory. And so he wore a badge of shame. He made sure that none of those Greeks in Corinth would ever think of him as a great cultured man. It's the opposite of pragmatism, isn't it? If we are going to build with gold and silver and precious stones, it means that our work must be done to the glory of God alone. Secondly, it means that it must be done through the word of God alone. Again, that was Paul's strategy when he came to Corinth. You remember, if you just look back to the first chapter of 1 Corinthians 1, he talks again about his own dilemmas. (1 Corinthians 1, verse 22). Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Here is Paul. He's arrived in Corinth, and he's got in front of him two mission fields. He's going to be preaching to Jewish people, and he's going to be preaching to sophisticated intellectual Greeks. And what do the Jews want? They want him to do miracles and signs. And they say, if you will do those, we will accept you as a true messenger. And what do the Greeks want? They want him to display that he's an expert in the philosophy of the world. And Paul says, I'm here to preach God's word. I am not here to display miraculous power. I'm not here in order to display intellectual expertise. I'm here to preach the word of God. Stuart Olliott has told us again and again and again, hasn't he? God's work is done by God's word. And if the work is not done by the word of God, it is not the work of God. And Paul, if he were sitting listening to Stuart Olliott, would be saying, Amen. Gold, silver, precious stones means work done by the patient application of the word of God. The preaching of the word in public, the application of the word to the small group and to the individual, the determination to bring God's word to bear upon a congregation and upon individuals and upon the world outside constantly by every means, but always and only the word of God. Thirdly, when Paul talks about work of gold and silver and costly stones, he's talking about work done according to the directives of God. So much of these letters to the Corinthians deals with churchmanship. It deals with the right regulation of the life of the church. Now, there were many ways in which in which Paul's instructions here clashed with the prevailing culture. So when you come to 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, Paul forbids any practice of ecstatic, unintelligible worship within the church. Now, in doing that, he was running flatly against every cultural norm, because that was exactly what was expected in the pagan temples of Corinth. People were expected to go off into outbursts of ecstatic worship in which neither they nor anybody else knew what was being said. And Paul said, it is contrary to everything God has commanded, and you must not do it. Again, Paul said to the members of that church, I do not allow a woman to teach. The women must remain silent. And again, it ran completely against the culture of the day, where every temple had its priestesses leading the worship. But Paul isn't concerned about conforming the work to the culture of the day. Paul isn't interested in making concessions and asking, well, how close can we get to the mindset of these pagan people without actually crossing a line? He's saying we want to stand right apart because we live by the directives of God. What does the law of God say? What did the Lord Jesus say? He insists that the work must be done according to the directives of God at every point. The temple builders of the Old Testament, they had no latitude. They knew exactly what the blueprint was that God had given, and they were to maintain it. Fourthly, the work is to be work that is done in the holiness of God. It is to be work that reflects without compromise God's unchanging and holy standards. You remember the words that Paul addresses to the Corinthians. We are the temple of the living God. Therefore come out from them, from the pagans, and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you. You will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. Paul there in Corinth preached an absolute standard of holiness, an uncompromising standard. He insisted that men and women must be as holy as God is holy. And if that meant that they lost their careers, then they must lose their careers. If it meant that they will be cut off from the society around them, they must be cut off from that society. There were those who tried to find formulae for compromise. Well, couldn't we have some truck with the pagan temples? We won't actually offer sacrifices, of course. We won't actually pray to the idols, of course. But surely it wouldn't do any harm for us to go into those pagan temples just to sit down at a meal table. Paul says, come out from among them and be separate. How can you go into that atmosphere? How can you condone the worship of those vile deities? He says it's inconceivable. You run from those places where wickedness is promoted. You seek to purify yourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit. There is no place for a believer in those foul temples of iniquity. There's no place for a believer today in the cinemas that turn every actor and every actress into a prostitute. There's no place for a believer there. There's no place for a believer in the theatres of London, where immorality and the destruction of human dignity are there in every play. There's no place. Come out, says Paul, come out from among them. He refuses to compromise the holy standards of God. He will not have believers in places, in careers, in structures that would defile their hearts and souls and minds. Fifthly, to build with gold and silver and precious stones is to build by the power of God. It's conspicuous, isn't it, how much of these Corinthian epistles is devoted to the theme of strength and weakness. And again, it would seem that Paul there in Corinth stripped himself of everything that would make him naturally strong. He refused to accept even financial support from the people he was working among because he wanted to be weak. He wanted to be a man who had to live dependent upon God alone every day, every hour. Paul in Corinth would have starved if God had not answered his prayers and supplied his needs. Paul strips himself of all natural human strength, and then God strips him further. God gives him that thorn in the flesh, which humbles him and makes him a fragile, vulnerable failure, humanly speaking. Because Paul knows that it's only when he's strong that he's weak, and only when he's weak that he's strong. Paul is determined that the work that's done in Corinth will have the power of God written across it, and that at the end of the day that no one will be able to say that this was done because of human resources, this was done because of human abilities, this was done because we had the right equipment, this was done because we had the right techniques, this was done because we had the right big names behind us. Paul will have none of that. Paul says if that work is going to be done, if a church is going to be built with gold and silver and precious stones, it's going to be built in human weakness and in divine power. And then finally, when Paul speaks of work done with gold and silver and precious stones, he's talking about work done for the love of God. The love of Christ constrains us. The love of Christ constrains us. No other motive will produce gold and silver and precious stones. Men can work energetically at church building for 1,000 reasons and 1,000 motives. They can work for a denomination. They can work for a tradition. They can work just because it's great, it's exhilarating to have success. They can work because it's their personality to work. Whatever they were doing, they would give themselves to it with all their energy and with all their drive. They can work because they want to impress other people. They can work because they want to bolster their own self-esteem. Paul says, I've learned that only work done out of a sense of the love of God, and only work done out of love for God is work that has any value. That's Paul's constraining, driving motive. He's been consumed by the thought that Christ loved him. And now that drives him to love men and women. If Christ died for all, then all died. I can view every one of these men, the Gentiles who were once my enemies, I can view them now as men who died and who are now my friends. He's got a new motive. To love and to work and to give himself sacrificially, and the motive is that he himself is consumed by the love of God in Christ. These are the marks of work done, for the work done that God counts as gold and silver and precious stones. It's work that's done for his glory. It's work that's done by his word. It's work that's done according to his directions. It's work that's done maintaining his holiness. It's work that's done depending on his power alone. It's work that's done out of love, out of constraining love, the love that is a response to God's love. Now, such work is costly. And such work is slow, and such work will consume everything a man has and everything a man is. But such work is gold and silver and precious stones. It's inestimably precious in the eyes of God. Now, a man who does work in that way may have very little to show for it in one sense. After 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. If you are building with those sort of rare materials, those sort of precious materials, it's unlikely that you're going to throw up something on the scale of the Taj Mahal. But what you do build will be precious. What you do build will be infinitely precious in the eyes of God. And that's what we've been hearing all the way through this assembly, haven't we? We've been hearing one man after another pleading with us to build with gold and silver and precious stones in different situations, in different contexts. We've been told to avoid the cheap compromises, to avoid the lowering of standards, to come back again and again and again to say this is God's work and it must be done in God's way. There is an option, and Paul speaks of that too here. If there are men who build with gold and silver and precious stones, there are also men, he says, who build with wood, hay, and straw. That's easy, isn't it? Those materials are readily available. You can get them anywhere, and they're very cheap, and they're very easy to work with. And you can very quickly throw up a very large and impressive edifice using wood and hay and stubble if you're prepared to flatter men and women and placate their vanity, and if you're prepared to rather than maintaining the directives of God in the life of the church, well then you can build something very quickly and very swiftly. And there are people all around us who are doing that, aren't they? And the temptation for us and for the people in our congregation is all the time to be looking over our shoulder at that man who came into the area and who began a new work just 18 months ago, and now they're packed to the doors and they're building that huge new tabernacle that'll seat 800 people. And our people say, well, what are we doing wrong? And it may be that when God looks, he says it's wood, and it's hay, and it's straw, and that's all. What do we want? Do we want something that is gold and silver and precious stones? Or do we envy those who are building their huge edifices of wood and hay and stubble? The day will make it known. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, or if any man builds on this foundation using wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. We are not building for this decade. We are not building for this century. We're not building for this millennium. We're building for eternity. We want our work to last, not just through all the changes that will come about in society in this century. We want our work to last when this world is rolled away, and when the great throne is set in place, and when the Lord Jesus Christ sits as assessor and judge, and when the fire of God's holiness sweeps across the universe and sweeps across our work. We want our work to last then. Wood, hay, stubble, flicker of flame and it's gone. It may last for a little while here in this world. But how long will it last when the fire of God's holiness is finally brought to bear upon it on the last day? How tragic, Paul says, that there will be some men who did spend their whole life building, and they will find on that day that they've built nothing that lasts. Maybe they're saved men themselves, for they discover that all those years invested have been invested in trash. Gold, silver, precious stones, no fire will destroy them. The work that you're doing, the work of patient exposition of the Word of God, the long hours of prayer, the patient loving, caring for the needy within your congregation, the going back again and again and again to ungrateful people to tell them of Christ. It may not bring spectacular results by men's estimation. It may not bring immediate fulfillment, but it's gold and it's silver and it's precious stones, and it will last the day. It will last the day of judgment. May God speak to our hearts through his holy and infallible word.